So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this evening, featuring UIC faculty members, writers, and producers, Gary Sandville and Ali Pasevas, who also holds 2 degrees from UIC, and UIC alumnus TJ Gordon, as they explore the collective gains from the Americans with Disabilities Act, disabled activists, scholars, and artists who are demanding continued efforts to make the world a more equitable place for disabled people. In this unique program, they will discuss the documentary film, Code of the Freaks, that explores the disability representation in Hollywood. Thank you to each of you for being with us this evening, and I'll turn it over to Carrie to begin our presentation and discussion.
All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us tonight. It's fun to see your names scroll by and where you're from. I am an associate professor in disability and human development, and I teach classes in disability and American film, disability culture, and some graduate theory class, although now Ali's teaching it, so I can't claim that anymore. I wanted to give you an overview of what we'll be doing tonight. So first, I'm going to give you an introduction to the overall project. And we'll also be showing a short trailer of the film just to remind everybody of what the film's about, or if you didn't get a chance to see it yet, you'll get a sense of the project. And then Ali Pasevas is going to talk about the concept and the framework, kind of what our organizing thoughts were about the film. And then Ali and I and TJ are going to get to the question that we've organized the evening around, is the film's relevance to the post-ADA climate, and kind of do some connecting to some current day issues, and then we'll be opening it up for discussion. So I think we are starting off with a poll. So did you get a chance to watch the full film? All right, are we waiting still a little bit longer? All right, 52% watched it and loved it. Yay. Notice we kind of stacked this poll. There was no other choice than really you loved it. So let's move ahead to the introduction to the overall project. So like I said, I teach a large introduction to disability in American film. We have 170 students in there, and I teach it face-to-face every fall and online every spring. Although this fall, I'm teaching it online again, of course. So the materials for the class closely mirror some of the things we talk about in the large lecture. And it's one of the ways that we like to bring our research and creative activity that we're doing out in the community and professionally into the classroom. And in fact, an earlier version of this film, we had some interviews that we weren't able to use for the final cut, and we've created small video vignettes of interview material that are completely unique to this class. You couldn't get anywhere else. And Ali was the one who put those together. So it started out when I moved here in 2009 to join the faculty, and I was having lunch with my friend Susan Nussbaum, the playwright and novelist, and Salome Chasnoff, the documentary filmmaker. And they were telling me about these, what they were calling salons that they had held at Access Living, which is our Chicago Center for Independent Living advocacy organization for people with disabilities. And they had put together a series of film clips around stereotypes about disability in the movies and shown them to community members, and then had a conversation about them. And the community members just really enjoyed that conversation and got a lot out of it. So they had done a couple more, and that spawned the idea to make a documentary on the topic. And Susan and Salome had worked together before, and I just so happened to be teaching the class, so it was perfect timing. And then I asked Allie to join us, and Allie began this project as a master's student and my research assistant. Over the years, she became a full-fledged collaborator. And I think that's another really wonderful thing about what we're able to do at a research university is bring our students into our projects and have them become full contributors. And the film has taken a long time to make. So between the time we started the film and the time it came out, Allie went from a master's student to a tenure track professor. So we began with a research and community engagement phase of doing the salons that Susan and Salome had started, and we organized them around themes, and some of those themes ended up in the movie. But we really wanted to gather the disability community's perspectives on how film impacted their lived experience. And so we went to different types of spaces. We went to different geographical locations. We went to community centers, churches, galleries, theaters, and we had some really fabulous discussions, and we taped those. And we showed an early version of that at the Chicago Humanities Festival in 2010. We also did a few presentations. We did a couple on children's films and animated films that didn't make it into the movie, but I have continued to use some of that material in my teaching. And we wanted to make sure that whatever we ended up doing would feel like a community response. So we didn't end up using the group conversations for the final film, but we wanted the sense that as different voices from the disability community joined the conversation through the interviews, it would start to feel like a community. And we wanted that to be in direct contrast to how Hollywood tends to isolate disabled characters. I think Sahai says in the movie that there's one character per disabled character per movie. Not always, but most of the time. We had a Kickstarter campaign to complete the film, but we also had applied and received grants. Some of we had one from the Chicago Community Trust, the Illinois Humanities Council. Also, some of my startup funds when I came to UIC were used, and that was the funding that I used to hire Allie and to do some of the early production work. And we recently got a grant it's a creative activity grant from the Illinois system, and that is to support some of the promotion of the film, but also to create a curriculum that goes with the film that we will be making available for mostly university professors. And those will go for people who had been supporters of the film and other people who are interested, because we want people to really use this in the classroom and have ideas of how to make it part of a larger curriculum. And the final movie had 13 interviews, and the interviewees were all people with disabilities, activists, artists, scholars, and TJ here, our third panelist, he was a student of mine as well. He was my master's student and also my teaching assistant for the film class. And TJ has been a fantastic interviewee and promoter of the film as well. So that's a good way for us to bring our students in and also to stay connected as they graduate. And I know that Anna Maria was one of my students. I saw her on here, and she took my class as well. And it's just great to see some of my former students on here. All right, so now let's see the trailer.
A movie that I like.
No, I can't name.
A movie that I like.
No, I can't name it. Yeah, it's a pretty short list.
I think that the image, the screen image, is the sole definer for the general population of disability.
There are a lot of stereotypes of disability in the movies. And in fact, there's nothing but.
How people are represented, of course, is not the decision of the community. It's the writer, the filmmaker, the actors even.
What life? I got no life! I'm in the dark here!
Killing disabled people is a happy ending. Curing disability is meant to be a happy ending. Institutionalizing is meant to be a happy ending.
People are always wanting to show little people as magical.
It seems as if that's the first thing blind people want, is to feel your face. I don't know, I've just never had that happen to me.
The evildoer, of course, is disfigured. I think somewhere in the dark reptilian part of our brains, we think, well, evildoers must be ugly.
Our job as disabled people is to become in a position of enough power to be able to input into that imagery.
Most people feel that to be able to think about a movie as you're seeing it is destroying your ability to enjoy the movie. And I would argue that it enhances your ability to enjoy the movie.
All right, so I think we have another poll that picks up where Susan left off. How does thinking about a movie impact your ability to enjoy it? So let's see what you say, whether you agree with Susan or not, or whether we've just totally ruined the movies for you.
We added some nuance to, this is Allie speaking. We've added some nuance to this question. So we've given you it depends on the movie.
All right, I'm passing the baton to you now, Allie.
Yeah, TJ writes, welcome to the spoilers. But hopefully the trailer gave you a little bit of, for those who haven't seen the film, a little bit of an idea of kind of our take on or our approach to the content, a little bit of the humor, and then some of our overarching critiques and observations. So it's interesting to see that so many of you agree with Susan, but also that nobody said it destroys your ability to watch movies, because this is one of the most common sort of comments that we get when we screen the film is questions about why don't we like any films, and people saying, well, now you've just ruined it for us. Which in some way I think is a nice lead-in to talking a little bit about how we arrived at telling the story that we have told. So as Carrie said, this film has had about a decade in its pre-production phase where we were trying to sort out the story. And some of that came from, you know, as Carrie mentioned, the number of community engagements that we had, the conversations with groups of people around these themes. But at the end of the day, what remained consistent in the 10 years of the film's development is our kind of interest in, and the community's interest in, tracking some of the common stereotypes, the common myths, the common framings that films use to depict disability and repeat over and over and over again. And that in itself is quite a big project to trace some of these repeated themes. But more than just telling a story about a kind of series of stereotypes, we followed the work of disability studies scholar David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, who highlighted the ways in which disability always serves as a storytelling device or as a narrative device, which in some ways is what gives us the stereotypes that we see. And so we tried to think about, as researchers, scholars, and activists making a film, how do you translate this kind of theoretical idea into something that is entertaining, that captures a community voice, and tells a story that's different from the use of disability as a narrative device, but rather tells the story of disabled people as experts, as storytellers themselves. But also somewhere in the process of making this film, as we were sort of tracking these stereotypes, we had this kind of epiphany, is what Susan calls it in the film, where we realized, wait a minute, on some level, whether we're talking about horror films or we're talking about charity films or talking about inspiration films, they're all in many ways telling the same story about disability, where it's using disability to make us all feel better about ourselves, to inspire non-disabled viewers and to inspire the non-disabled characters in the story to be better people. And so this also felt like, in many ways, how we were forwarding scholarship. Even as we were presenting material, we were sort of bringing a perspective that was new and fresh to film critique. And part of that arose from just the varied responses that we try to capture in the film. So even though we're all in many ways critiquing what we're seeing on the screen, it was really important to us as a collective to make sure that we presented not a singular voice or a singular type of critique, but captured the ways that disabled people themselves or ourselves we still have our unique perspective in our critique. And so I think this is what having so many different voices in the film coming from so many different perspectives offers. You get to see us disagree a little bit about which films we like or whether there are redeeming qualities in films or not. That's part of what is kind of captured in showcasing the community's voice. So I would ask, yes, perfect. So part of our kind of goal for today is to bring the film into this moment. So to lay the groundwork for that, let's ask how familiar folks are with the ADA. One, are you an expert? Some familiarity, you've heard of it, or what's the ADA? I like to see that people change their votes. The longer you think about it, you're like, no expert. That's how I feel. Okay, perfect. That gives us a nice kind of overview and sense of leading into the rest of the discussion. So for those who aren't familiar at all, the ADA just references the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the poll keeps popping up, sorry. And this July, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the ADA. Could we go to the next? Yeah, perfect. So I don't know, Carrie, do you want to jump in and then we'll come back to the ADA? Sorry,
Sure.
I got ahead of ourselves. This happens very often I've know a couple folks who are also on the chat for who are students of mine. So I guess in some ways this is very familiar to you. I always get ahead of myself.
That's okay, I do too. But one of the things that was reinforced for us, even though I think it was something that we had already seen in existing scholarship, is that these stereotypes start from the very emergence of film, like from the very first films that were made, and they continue right up today. And it's so surprising, and not surprising, I guess, how persistent they are. And we had done some archival research and literature reviews. Allie went and visited some archives, collected material. So that was interesting, but we also noticed how these stereotypes tended to ebb and flow in popularity depending on what was going on socially and culturally for people with disabilities in different time periods. And so at this moment, when we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the ADA, it's a little bit frustrating, to be honest, that there hasn't been that much change. I will say, though, that where we are seeing some change is in television, especially in some of the streaming series. And television is a different, medium than film, because you have a long period of time to develop a story arc. And so, the writers have to come up with something beyond these stereotypes at some point. But I think also we're starting to get a few disabled people behind the camera and in front of the camera. There's still very, very few. One of my areas of research is on casting of disabled actors, training of disabled actors, training for arts professions. And despite the advances that we have made and some change in representation, there are very, very, very few people with disabilities in I would say Hollywood, but also outside of Hollywood, pretty much in any arts context. And that's frustrating. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the reasons go all the way back, through a student's entire developmental process. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to change is interrupting that pattern of exclusion that the ADA has promised and is not quite panned out for us in the arts and entertainment industries. So I think that's one of the ways that I'm thinking really, a strong connection between that civil rights era laws and what shows up then in representation or not. So Allie, you were going to address the second one.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things that when we talk about Hollywood representations of disability, we see a lot of people saying, but it's getting better, right? And you addressed this a little bit. In some ways, it is getting better, and in some ways, it's actually more of the same. And it struck me as we were celebrating 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act and sort of the landmark legislation that it offers as a civil rights law. This celebration is set against kind of the realities of many disabled people's lives that haven't changed. And in some accounts have actually gotten, I mean, not to make it a comparative, but the situation for a lot of disabled people is as if the legislation never happened. And so in a lot of ways, I think this is kind of captured in the tensions around depictions of disability in film, but it also is why a kind of overarching story that captures those depictions and opens a conversation to how they might impact how the world views disabled people is so important and so relevant. And I think, as an interview in the film, TJ speaks to this in the film, but he also has recently written about this in a beautiful piece on the Disability Visibility Project's website capturing kind of some of the promises and the tensions within the ADA, but also the need for community celebration and community joy. So I'll let TJ talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll kind of come back to some of those tensions in our discussion. So.
I mean, part of what I'm doing right now, I'm glad you all mentioned celebration and joy, because this is a joyous occasion where I get to speak to you all about a film that was a part of, and also as a viewer, I enjoyed the film as well. And probably maybe 30 years ago, because pretty much, you know, 88 is pretty much just as old as me. I'm pretty much born into the 88, but about 30 years ago, it would have been a possibility for me to be in that arena, especially if we didn't have the 88 at all. And I kind of alluded to what would a perfect future for the 88 would look like, not only in Code of the Freaks, but also in the piece that I wrote for 88 38 Color called Black Artistic Joy. I think to tie in those two pieces, I think the goal of Black Artistic Joy is to show the possibility of what 88 can do. Not only it can get you into the building with accessibility, but also you can actually live the life that you want. You could work, you could marry, you could pretty much do whatever you want to do, as long as, you know, it's not breaking the law. But like what I wrote about in Black Artistic Joy, what I mentioned in radio, where at the end, after radio help open the eyes of the community and help them expose to race and disability more, instead of radio becoming a head coach, radio still gets to cheer. And as it no doesn't get married, does he become a coach for Hannah High School in South Carolina or beyond that? I don't know. Who knows? But it seems like the realities and even the hopes and dreams for disabled people of color in real life are very separate from what is being portrayed on film. And according to the quote that I have, which is 30 years after it was signed into law, the ADA is not the only answer to any oppression. There we go. Any oppression among Black, autistics, deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent people. The ADA must be more than a law that requires compliance. It should do more than provide access to employment, education, and basic needs. We need to create cultural access to all important things in Black communities, as well as physical and mental access. The second quote is very important to me, and I think it should be the quote that we should take away from tonight, is because, see, I could only speak for my experience as a Black disabled person, but it seems that whether I was born in the Black community or raised in the Black community all my life, it seems that when we talk about disability is shunned, or disability is the last thing people want to mention. Or if we talk about a disabled person in communities of color in general, then we just say, you know, that person's cute and inspirational, but that's about it. Even though there's no push for inclusion. I think it also works in films as well, where when main characters of color who also are also disabled are being portrayed, and I think Allie and Carrie alluded to it earlier, where it seems that those characters are only here for the betterment of the community, but not for themselves. And you know, people with disabilities in general, especially disabled people of color, have dreams and hopes too beyond just being happy where they're at. They want to do things in life as well. But some of the films that we see over and over again, whether it's radio, and I could go on and on with other movies, it seems that the narrative is that that person should be fine where they are right now because they have the support of the community, but they cannot go beyond the protection and the joys of the community. And another thing to consider also, of course, is that just like in any other situation where non-disabled folks play disabled characters, I think the same could be said for non-disabled people of color. No, non-disabled people of color playing the roles of disabled people of color. If the ADA is created for people to work or get into Hollywood, why can't we do the same for disabled people of color who wants to be in Hollywood, who wants to act, who wants to dance for a living, who wants to entertain folks for a living? But I think it's comes back to the fears of the mainstream community, or in my piece, the Black community of people of color, and also that even though the ADA exists, people will still, unless there is a revolutionary change, people will still see disabled people of color as just pets or people who will be happy as long as they be cared by the family members in the community, and there should be no need to get a job or be somebody's life. So that's all I have on this. Oh yeah, and one more thing is when I talk about cultural access to important things, cultural access meaning access to places like churches, stores, restaurants, anything that represents a particular community. What I mean by creating that cultural access is not just about getting to point A to point B, but also how can disabled people of color enjoy the same thing as everybody else in communities of color. That's all I have.
Thank you, TJ. I think this is a really nice lead into kind of what we hope Code of the Freaks can do, in terms of creating cultural access. So before we get into the discussion at large, what role do you think films play in shaping understandings of disability? It's a bit of a stretch to connect films to real life. They're just films after all. Or some small role. Yeah, okay, films play a crucial role in shaping how people view disabled people.
The world may never know.
Well, we'll know because we have the poll.
True.
We just need to poll the world. So we have a pretty good consensus. And I think in some ways it's a leading question, right? Because we have just spent, 40 minutes talking to you about how the real world helped us make this film and the interventions that we want the film to make. But I also wanted this question to kind of set us into the larger discussion, because there's so much happening in the world right now that is tied to questions of access, questions of equity, and we think tied to questions of representation. But we'd love to open it up to the audience for your questions about that or anything that we've said tonight.
Well, thank you to the three of you. If I can jump in, we had some pre-questions come, and I think if I could ask all three of you to respond to this first one, that would be great. So the question is, what makes a film about disability representation relevant in today's world? I would like to take that first.
I can start us off. Well, right now, as going through this really difficult time, I think it has a lot to reflect about how people with disabilities are being treated right now in the pandemic, and also with some of the police violence and the uprisings against those. One of the themes that we explore in the film is a strand of representation that portrays disabled people as better off dead. And there's been a lot of discussion in the disability community about some of the healthcare rationing or decisions about who may get treatment or treatment triage from the pandemic. So there are disability issues throughout those conversations, and they are the same conversations that are happening in the movies, and most of the time it doesn't end well for the disabled characters. So that's a relevant, I think, very relevant issue. And I like to tell my students in the film class that when we talk about these films, that even if they don't have a disability or know someone who does, that disability is part of the human condition and they will encounter it. So I think at least one of my hopes is that it will give people an opportunity to have some discussions that the film raises, because we can't, we just kind of start the discussions in the movie, but it can get people to think so that when they encounter something in real life, they're not kind of repeating the tropes of the movie, that they'll be able to think more critically. Our collaborator, Susan Nussbaum, she tells the story pretty frequently in Q&As about how when she was first disabled and she was at the Rehab Institute of Chicago, she had very dark times where she didn't have any idea of how she would live as a disabled person. She said she had no role models except for what she saw in the movies. And so part of her reason for participating in this project is having that sense of disability community and having a sense of that life with a disability is worth living is, is so important to reinforce. And it seems like it should go without saying, but it really doesn't. Ali or TJ?
Ali?
Yeah, I think I would add that on top of picking apart this kind of common underlying theme that disabled lives are less valuable or less worth living, part of what TJ mentioned, that there's a differential depiction of those people with disabilities who might have a future if they could just try hard enough. And I think that also speaks to some of the racial disparities that we also see in how COVID treatment is getting, or treatment for COVID is getting sort of, played out. But I think also one of the things that I hope the film does is capture disabled people talking back, right? And so even if that is the first time somebody sees disabled people being subjects, having ownership over and having critique of these stories, it plants a seed, and it shows a kind of dissent to these common ideas. And that seed is what we hope gets picked up in what's happening in the world today, where you come across a story of a disabled man who was left to die, and you hear those voices, or even if it's a new conversation, wait, there's a community of disabled people that have something to say. Yeah, I'm getting all worked up, but I'll hand it off to TJ now.
No, it's all good. That's what we here for. We're very passionate about what we do in the disability community, especially when it comes to addressing media representation. And to add to what Carrie and Ali already mentioned, especially during the pandemic and it's not just the police violence, but you might as well say a racial clash again, something equivalent to the 1960s or before that, where it was just blatantly confrontational, to say the least. We seen that, while the films are portraying a life where the people with disabilities are happy where they're at right now, and not just end up being there, but also with families or in institutions. There's the real world where people with disabilities are sick of being in institutions, in jails, in homes with mom and dad, or group homes. People with disabilities want to be out in the world as well. But because of the ableism and the racism and the sexism that goes on, it's hard for people with disabilities to just flourish on screen, even if they are represented by non-disabled counterparts. But to add to what Ali said about the notion that, and also Carrie said it too, that disabled lives doesn't matter at the end, according to what's being portrayed in media. There's also, I believe, a potential positive moment that we could see role models and heroes in films about disability. And I'm not talking about the usual supercrip where the person has superpowers or mutant powers. No, I'm not talking about that type of superhero. I'm talking like everyday people who are making a difference in the community, but also have a disability as well. And one example of it is actually the film Harriet, which talks about the life of Harriet Tubman. They didn't talk about her disability in the movie directly, but we did to see how she uses her neurodiversity in the form of dream, as well as her mentions of her traumatic brain injury that occurred earlier in her life to help people go to initially to the north and eventually to Canada safely to freedom. So in a, I would say in a modern sense, we had the potential to show people that it's a, you could be a role model for any community, especially the disability community. You don't have to hide your disability if that disability should be in the narrative.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions. Whoever would like to take this one. With regard to improving disability representation, do advocacy groups have Hollywood's ear in any capacity?
I think that's a question for Carrie, who has done work on this.
There is a union effort among disabled actors in Screen Actors Guild and other union representations, and they are working to increase the participation by disabled actors for disabled roles. And there's been more and more internet activism that I'm seeing it a lot, and maybe my Facebook feed is really curated to this, but there are hashtag campaigns about, Oscars excluding people with disabilities. There are industry showcases where casting agents and directors are invited to see disabled talent, which is the category that disabled actors fall in, and break down casting breakdowns. Disabled talent. So there are also some casting directors now that specialize in casting people with disabilities. There's been some public conversations in the trade press on the issues. So Hollywood is listening. And one of the things that I find, though, so frustrating is that there is this activism, and there are all of these things going on. And then there are some frustrating things going on that prevent us from really understanding what has been done and what can be done. So, for instance, one of the things the unions have been upset about is that when there's auditions for a film, they need to keep track of people in different minority categories that they auditioned, but they don't have to keep track of people with disabilities. So when they're called out for not casting a disabled actor in a disabled role, they can say, oh yeah, we auditioned disabled people, but there's no way to follow up on that. So I know that's like a big agenda item. I think also that what gets frustrating is, this is some research I did last summer, is that there are a few services that casting directors and directors of theater and film can use to find databases of actors with disabilities. But once you start looking at the numbers, they start to become really, really small, because especially in movies, the casting is really specific. You need to be a certain age, gender, body type, ethnicity, race. I mean, it's so specific, and so few actors have training in those particular, who fit those particular categories. So, and the people who are available tend to be actors who are not trained. So there's if they are going to be hired, then they need a lot of coaching, and they need a lot of training, and a lot of Hollywood outfits are just not willing to put in that kind of time. And I don't see this actually changing anytime soon because there are just not enough people in the pipeline. You know, we had our first wheelchair using actor just a few years ago in Oklahoma on Broadway. In the entire history of Broadway, there's one, and then there were two after the first one in that Tennessee Williams Glass Menagerie. So it was Oklahoma and Glass Menagerie. We have two. There's deaf representation. So anyway, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss, and I could take up the rest of the time. So I'll leave it there.
I think this is maybe a good follow-up question to that. The question is, or I guess it's a statement first. The person says, I love horror movies, but can clearly see that there is a historical problem with regard to interfacing with disability. How do we solve this problem in particular?
Good question. I mean, the standard answer would be, of course, finding more disabled actors, but even then, we will still have this issue of horror as basically a way to show audiences that disability is a scary thing. So I think in order for that dynamic to change, Hollywood in general, or just the whole media industry, should encourage movies and TV shows and documentaries that not only portray horror, and not only put disabled people as either scary or fragile or whatnot, but also create content where the disabled character triumphs as well. And it doesn't have to be horror. It could be action. It could be romantic comedy. It could be romance. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be horror all the time. So I think it's up to the writers to create content that is more inclusive to the disability community in general, especially disabled actors. It doesn't have to always have a narrative of disabled people being the scary folks or the bad guy or the bad people. And I understand that, that's what sells, but we also have the voice where we can just say, that's not what we want. Give us something more. Give us something better.
Thank you, TJ. I had another question just came in, so I have two more questions if you indulge me, maybe just a few extra moments. The question came in, I think, in response to Carrie's last response, which is, what about disabled actors for non-disabled roles for any character? And then the person comments, it used to be that people of color were only considered for roles of color, and there's been some shift towards considering a character whose skin color isn't specified. So thoughts about?
Yeah, so every once in a while it happens. So in the Broadway examples I just gave with Oklahoma, that wasn't written for a disabled actor at all, and it got a lot of attention. And one of the issues that I experienced in my actor training and my career advice was being told that I wouldn't have a professional acting career because disability, audiences will always wonder why the character is disabled because of what Ali was talking about, that disability is so embedded in our cultural imaginary as a narrative device. There's the old saying that the acting teacher, director, Stanislavski, put in his directing notes is that, you know, if a gun appears on stage in Act 1, it's going to go off by Act 5. A gun does not appear on the stage unless it shoots. And so disability is like that. Disability doesn't appear unless it's going to be significant to the plot. So what we hear as disabled performers is, you know, we can't, it's just too confusing for the audience. And then sometimes even when disabled actors play disabled characters, like in the Glass Menagerie on Broadway, there is then a focus on the accusations by critics that they're not really acting. There's this bizarre notion that if you are disabled and play a disabled character, that's not acting. I mean, non-disabled people are acting when they play non-disabled characters. So that's another interesting thing too. It's just not done very often, and I would like to see more of it. But I think that maybe we'll see more of that in television, definitely in theater, but I think in movies that's a long way off.
Interesting. So last question for all three of you. The question is, what do you think, and I'm also going to add and hope, Coda Freaks can accomplish?
Well, we set out to, you know, take over the world with our ideas. So I feel like we should really hold on to that that aspiration. But in sort of more realistic terms, we hope it starts a conversation. We hope that it gets people to think about other films. And, you know, Susan sort of has at the end of the film the comment about we need more critical gaze. We need people to be looking at films critically. And we hope on some level that our film gives people tools to do that, related to representations of disability. I don't know if Carrie and TJ want to add anything.
I'll definitely add something. I think my response is more practical. I hope with after you watch Coda the Freaks, not only you'll get another take on how to analyze films about disability, but also you'll get a better idea of the importance of hiring disabled actors and paying them well to take the roles. So in short, I hope you know our message, which is pay us, please, well, and let us make movies.
You know, Salome, our director in Q&As, she says something that just really struck me, is that one of the things she was hoping for was that young film students, aspiring writers especially, will see this and it will open up their minds and their perspectives when they set out to write and include disabled people, and that our lives are so much richer and more interesting and funny and, you know, everything across the board, and that there are so many untold disability stories. There's like a gold mine of stories out there. So I hope that we can just kind of get these stereotypes out of the way. Like I've been able to change my curriculum in the film class because I have this movie, and I'm able to show more work by disabled people because kind of got those stereotypes out of the way. So I hope that it becomes adopted in other university curriculums especially.
Well, thank you to all three of you. It's truly been a privilege to spend time with you and to have this discussion. On a personal note, I found the film completely eye-opening. It was, to your point, a different perspective, and I just will look at Hollywood very differently now. So thank you again for sharing your time and your talent with us this evening. We are very, very grateful. Please join us for our next alumni exchange event on Thursday, September 9th at noon Central Standard Time, featuring a panel of experts from the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, or otherwise known as CUPA, who will address how our local, state, and national governments can respond to the impact that COVID has had on our communities as they present the coronavirus and its economic impact and silver linings. You can find more information and the slides from this presentation and the recording at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for our survey. Thank you again to our 3 distinguished panelists. We're so grateful and so proud that we have 2 of you as UIC graduates and certainly faculty members. We're very, very grateful for your time and talent and making a difference in this world. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us for Alumni Exchange, and we look forward to seeing you again in a future program. Have a great rest of your evening. Thanks again.